Issues Reports is made possible by the generous financial support from Irma and Norman Brayman.
Hello, I'm Helen Foray. Welcome to Issues Reports, a new program we bring to you that looks deeper into issues affecting South Florida residents. Today, we look at how Miami-Dade County government officials have for years neglected to properly invest in the county's infrastructure, which has now become a multi-billion-dollar headache for all. It is estimated to cost each man, woman, and child $4,700 over the next 2 decades. Are we throwing our money down the drain? Every living thing depends upon water to survive. It's a vital resource for our health, environment, recreation, and economy. So it is surprising that Miami-Dade County officials have neglected to repair our county's infrastructure system to the detriment of the environment and the pocketbook.
This has been an ongoing problem of raw sewage, not necessarily a nice topic, but raw sewage flowing into Biscayne Bay, flowing into the Miami River, and out into the Atlantic Ocean. So it's a pollution and it's a public health issue. And there's also a very important taxpayer issue because we're not getting what we pay for.
Environmental lawyer Albert Slapp should know he represents the Biscayne Bay Waterkeepers, an environmental group that has filed a lawsuit against Miami-Dade County for violating the Clean Water Act of 1972. They are not alone. Federal and state officials have filed suit as well, as seen in a consent decree.
A consent decree is something where the county says, I agree to do this to fix this problem. And the counterpart being the EPA says, I accept your proposed solutions, and by way of this consent decree, we'll make it a legal binding agreement that you will do this in X amount of time. The fact is that several consent decrees have been signed over the years, and the problems have continued. But the bigger problem is that the consent decree does not include any provisions to protect the facilities from the expected impacts. This is not theoretical impacts. These are expected impacts of storm surge, hurricanes, and the exacerbating factor of sea level rise over time. There's not a single penny, not a single line in that budget, $1.6 billion, that says we're going to do this to stop waves from crashing against these facilities.
$1.6 billion, and that's just for starters. It is calculated that the county will be spending upwards of $12 billion over the next 15 to 20 years to fix the county's infrastructure needs. Doug Yoder, Deputy Director of Miami-Dade Water and Sewer, argues that the water and sewer plant in Virginia Key can handle rising sea levels and flooding.
Elevation is really the only defense against sea level and the groundwater rising with the sea. Our facilities here at Virginia Key are at least 10 feet above sea level, and in some cases up to 20 feet. A 3-foot rise in sea level would still leave this plant above water. It would not leave other parts of the service area above water. The Clean Water Act, of course, on which the consent decree is based, never specifically contemplated climate change and sea level rise from back in 1972 and some amendments since then. So there is no set of specific standards that we as a utility, for example, would need to adhere to address that.
But climate change is just one challenge for Miami-Dade Water and Sewer, and aging infrastructure is another. Referring to an underwater sewer pipe, former Director John Renfro is quoted in Miami Today as saying, "The pipe is about to burst. We're facing a catastrophic event if this happens. We can't afford any delay." But they did delay. If there were a break in an underwater pipe, the effects would be devastating, not only to public health, but to tourism as well.
People forget that underneath us are many, a system of pipes that are so old. That's why we have water main breaks. That's why we have sewer issues. We have to protect our ecosystem. Otherwise, can you imagine a sewer outbreak in the middle of Biscayne Bay? We're a tourism economy. We can't afford to wait anymore.
The county has failed, and in my view, deliberately failed to comply with the law, which means it's more in the ambient of a criminal act, because if you knowingly violate a law, then it's no longer being incompetent. I guarantee you, if the FBI comes in water and sewer, they need a few bosses to bring people to jail.
Miami-Dade Mayor Carlos Jimenez acknowledges he doesn't have a good relationship with the union leader, but dismisses the accusations of corruption.
And because corruption, I have. Okay, where is it? Is it inside the union, or is it inside, the workforce? Emilio and I have had we don't have the best of relationships because I see things a different way than he says. He is the union president. He's got a certain job to do, protecting his employees, the people that he represents. Mine's different. I am the leader of this organization. I am the mayor, the strong mayor of Miami-Dade County, but I see my job as not protecting the status quo. I see my job as changing it for the better.
Officials today will point out that the cost of water in Miami-Dade is one of the lowest in the nation, certainly when compared to major metropolitan areas and throughout the state. But was it too low to keep up with the cost of repairs? But if the rates were too low, why did county officials take, over time, more than $200 million out of water and sewer to be put into the general fund?
To conclude that the diversion of some of those funds caused issues that we are now experiencing directly is not totally founded. If we had had that $200 million and spent it, it doesn't mean that the large sewer pipe that failed a couple of years ago and discharged 20 million gallons of raw sewage into a canal would not have occurred.
Historically, there's always been a culture in the county where if it was an area that had extra money, you'd take that money from that department and you'd put it in other areas. Those are called, certain areas are called proprietary, so they generate their own revenue. Water and sewers, one, the port and the airport. The port and the airport are regulated by the federal government to a certain degree through the FAA and the ports, so they can't really siphon that kind of money. So the only department where the county could go in and take money out of was water and sewer.
We're not taking money. We were taking money for a number of years. Previous administrations took out probably $500 million out of the system and put it in the general fund. During my first year as mayor, in order to balance the budget, I took out $25 million as a loan, which we are repaying. Since then, we have not taken any money, and we will not take any money out of water and sewer for balancing the general fund. And so that's my pledge. We've already repaid the first $5 million back to water and sewer, and we will continue to do so under my administration. That was a bad practice. It should never happen. We would have had $500 million more, hopefully more, of infrastructure improvement in the water and sewer department had we not had the county not taken that for the last 10 or 15 years.
The old scheme of where we would sit there and wait for Tallahassee or Washington, D.C. to send us big checks so that we can spend it on our infrastructure, those days are gone. The folks who now have money are private equity groups and private businesses who have developed this niche, this expertise in being able to provide public services in a much more cost-efficient way than government can.
So we have to comply with the consent decree, and so inevitably the water rates will go up. But by saying that, we want them to grow up as little as possible, and that's why we are going to be looking very hard at public-private partnerships, a way to squeeze out as much capital improvements, squeeze out as much efficiency as we can, and only raise the rates to the level that we absolutely have to. If we went about it the same old way, the way we've been doing business here in Miami-Dade County, the rates would go up much higher.
One of the biggest challenges that government has is how do you maintain the growth of government in check so that it's not growing at 8-10% a year, but it's growing 3-4%. Because by doing that, you alleviate, again, that pressure of having to increase taxes. So you got to create a system where those costs start going up in a small percentage. I'll give you an example. The county last year collected 6.6% more revenue than the previous year. Yet you saw all the problems with the fire department, with the libraries, and with all these cuts that we had to do. How could a government that grew that collected 6.6% more money have that crisis? That tells you there is a problem. We should be able to, without having to increase the millage, be able to collect 5% more revenue and be able to cover all our costs.
If Commissioner Zapata is right that there is a problem, that may explain why there are many skeptics who don't believe Miami-Dade County officials are able to change the culture of government that has led to inefficiencies, lack of transparency, and zero accountability.
You know, we do a lot of cost shifting from one area to another, and what it does is it takes away the transparency and accountability. I mean, you want to be able to look at a department and be able to measure their performance and create incentives to enhance the efficiency of that department, improve the services that they're providing, and not somehow have the good work of one department have to sustain the poor work of another.
I think that when we're dealing with taxpayer dollars, when we're dealing with regaining the trust of the public, the county needs to step up and do the right thing, and I think in this case they will. We will see that happen. We don't have a choice. We can't have a water main sewer break in the middle of Art Basel. Can you imagine what that would do to our economy?
Because Miami is going through another building boom. It's a world-class city. I love living here. People are flocking here. We need to have world-class infrastructure that leads the way.
What have you learned from the consent decree?
Well, I think the main lesson is that perhaps somewhat counter to human nature, you really can't take the position that you're going to wait until it's broken before you fix it. And we need to more effectively communicate that message to our customers, to the public in general, so that our elected officials are comfortable making the decisions that really need to be made.
The first steps are always the most difficult ones, but once that starts to roll, then we're going to get these projects out.
There are a few new developments to this story. Miami-Dade Water and Sewer Director John Renfro resigned a few weeks ago, saying he was ready to retire. Replacing him is Bill Johnson, who was formerly with the Port of Miami. Federal District Judge Federico Moreno, who oversees the consent decree, finally decided not to appoint a special master at this point in time to ensure the county complies with its legal obligations. The Biscayne Bay waterkeepers are continuing their legal battle against the county because the consent decree does not force the county to make sure the infrastructure is protected against the damage caused by climate change. There are many good people who work in Miami-Dade Water and Sewer and in county government. The concern and criticism is towards policymakers who didn't make the tough decisions that needed to be made at the right time. Why is this so hard? Is it just the culture of government? We ask former state attorney Dan Gelber. He is also former U.S. attorney for South Florida. And also former County Commissioner Katie Sorensen, who directs the Good Government Initiative at the University of Miami. Welcome to both of you. Dan, ladies go first.
Absolutely.
Katie Sorensen, former commissioner, you've been there. Why is this so difficult to do? We 3 consent decrees in county against Miami-Dade County. The county knows that it's been in violation, and it knows it needs to do tough decision-making, but it doesn't happen. Why?
Well, I think part of it, Helen, is that you have a culture and a county that is very anti-tax, anti-fee. So you always have that overlay of everything. And that's a real problem. So when rates really need to be raised, there's not the political will to do it. And when I was there, you had a committee chairperson over water and sewer who really ruled with an iron fist. And she did not want to hear anything she didn't want to hear.
This was former Commissioner Natasha Sejas.
Yes, yes. And then you had department directors who were sometimes scared of their own shadow and didn't want to tell her anything that she didn't want to hear. So I think a lot of it happened there in that political environment.
But let me challenge you for a moment on the anti-tax, anti-fee part of it, because for over 15 years, $200 million was taken out of Miami-Dade Water and Sewer and thrown into the general fund, because no matter what, there's always a hole in county government and the budget. So the money was there, and that's not to say it would have solved all of the problems, but the money's being taken out.
The money was there. It's called an equity transfer, and that money then went to fund the general fund so that you wouldn't have to raise taxes. Getting back to the whole anti-tax thing, that's why that money was transferred. It's a legitimate, by the way, expenditure of funds. Many municipalities do it. Take from one proprietary department and use it for the general fund. I mean,
yes, but not when, Dan, and I'm sorry, but not, Dan, when you get to the point then that you're hurting the infrastructure. And now with this consent decree, it's $1.6 billion that has to be put into that, which bonds have been emitted in order to be able to cover that cost. $1.6 billion, and to put it in perspective, 1 year of county budget is $4 billion. That's a lot of money.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think when you talk about political government, and it's not just professional government, but people who are elected, it's always very hard to get elected officials to take the long view. Right. What I mean by the long view is sort of not just something that's going to affect them when they're running for re-election, but something that's going to affect their children or their grandchildren. That's always hard. But what's even harder is when you're dealing with an issue like infrastructure and water issues, where people don't think it affects their daily lives. You know, and you're protecting against events, a cataclysmic rupture, that is hard to really imagine. It's an unthinkable event. So you're trying to get people to accept huge amounts of attention and cost to something that they can't even fathom is affecting their daily lives. You overlay the politics of it and the inability, I think, these days of any elected officials to really look beyond their next election cycle, and you realize why something is sort of pushed to the back. It's because, frankly, from an elected official's point of view, it's not helping them to be pushing it to the front.
Right, and the other thing about that is that term limits has really exacerbated that phenomenon. The public loves the idea of term limits, but what they don't like the idea is that nobody's thinking long term. And these issues have to be thought about long term. We have to be thinking 30 years out and even 100 years out.
Okay, but you've both been elected officials, and the reason we invited you here is because you're both highly respected in the community and throughout the state. Even with term limits, and many would agree with you, Katie Sorensen, about the issue of term limits and not taking the long view. But let's just say you're in it for 2 years or for 4 years. You knew that as you were running for office. So why not make that tough decision? And you know what? If you're not there to make that tough decision, why bother running at all?
Well, I mean, I deal with a lot of people who are thinking about running for office, and my current position as the founder of the Good Government Initiative, but I think that it depends on why you ran for office to begin with. If you're there just to occupy a seat and to get all the perks of the office, that's one thing, and unfortunately we have too many people doing that. If you're there to really get something done, then yes, you have to make tough decisions and think long beyond the time that you're in office. But for people who have to run for re-election, those are always considerations. That's something that they have to think about. Is this fee increase today going to be worth me being out of office, or will I be able to educate the public so that they understand why this is necessary? Now, I would advocate that it's your responsibility as an elected official to educate your public so they understand why they need to be paying for infrastructure.
Last year, Dan Gelber, in Miami-Dade County, people said, yes, let's go into debt to help Jackson Memorial Hospital. Yes, let's approve bond emissions to go into debt for education, K through 12 for public schools. I think when people believe in a very specific project and or in that leadership, they do say, yeah, we will take that step and we will support it, even if it means ultimately we're going to have to pay more for it. It's just that I think that there's a lack of confidence in leadership sometimes, or in this broad entity that we call county government.
My favorite elected officials are those that tell people what they probably don't want to hear, because I feel like they're trying to educate their constituents. And I really believe that a lot of this is not, some of it is the short term of elected officials, and some of it, though, is the short term of the voters, where they are more likely to show up to complain about a tax increase than they are to complain about not addressing a long-term issue. And the two examples you raised, education and healthcare, people believe that that impacts their daily lives. They've got children in public schools. They might, God forbid, end up in an emergency room. But somebody has to explain to them, and it has to be the elected official, that if our failure to deal with our infrastructure, specifically our water and sewers, has a potential devastating impact on your daily life.
You know, and the ironic thing is that our water and sewer rates are some of the lowest in the country. $45 a month on average compared to $60 a month in Broward, $160 in Atlanta. Ours is really cheap. People buy bottles of water for $1.50 and think nothing of it. And use, I mean, our water use has gone down from 155 gallons per person now to 135 gallons per day. That's an awful lot of water. Women in Africa work all day to get just a jug of water on top of their head and value that water. We don't value it as a precious resource.
We take our resources for granted, which is something we can't afford to do anymore on any sense. But when you look at part of the problems that we have locally, and I would say statewide, but this is just to look at on a local issue. Miami-Dade County government made $6.6 more in revenues than the previous year. And yet, as Commissioner Zapata pointed out, we still have budget problems. How can that be? We brought in 6.6 more. Clearly, there's a problem. A lot has to do with labor costs. The growth of government and the cost of government is, and this is not unique to Miami-Dade County, many municipalities are facing this. The growth of government and the cost of government is outpacing the growth and the cost of the economy.
Well, but the other thing is that other costs go up regardless of government. Labor costs is not the only thing that goes up. It's also energy costs, huge increases, and the county funds fleets of garbage trucks and buses and Metro Rail, and healthcare costs go up. So all those costs have to be considered, and those are beyond the control of county government. They have to respond to those costs, and they have to pay those costs. Building costs. As building costs go up, and we have huge building programs, and all of that has to be factored in. So it's not as though county can control all of that.
Yeah, look, if you are going to settle your issues of the day and your challenges as a community with bumper stickers, then you're going to lose in either the short term and probably the long term. And I think, you know, I don't know how many news shows I've seen on this topic. This is the only one I think I've seen. And frankly, that's the problem. Unless voters understand and believe this is an issue, you're not going to expect your elected officials to believe it. And I think that's, so I think there's a lot of blame to go around. But I do think at the end of the day, when you run for office, you should be running to tell people what you think they need to hear.
Let me ask you, Dan, and Katie as well. Maybe part of the problem is the way we budget, because as soon as you finish one, the budget is approved. The immediate next day, you have a new budget negotiation starting. So you're always like in budget chaos. Should we doing budgets like 2 years? More or less, because that way you can then begin to start looking more long-term?
Very few organizations don't have 5-year and 10-year plans. I mean, even in state government, there are committees who sit around and look at a longer range. And we have the apparatus in state government to be able to do that. We have committees whose only job is to forecast income that's coming in and expenses. And they change every couple months. They meet and they go through a phenomenal amount of data points to figure that out. That's how professional government operates. And frankly, state government, by our Constitution, cannot budget money we don't have. I mean, we literally can't do that by law. It's just all these elected officials from state government say, look, I balanced our budget every year for 20 years. Well, that's because we've never not had a balanced budget.
Because you cannot not
we
do
can't
so.
not do that.
I'm saying it like an attorney. You're double negative.
But the other thing is that the public has to be educated about the budget way far in advance. I mean, you can't expect people to show up at a budget hearing in September and start railing about something that's already really it's already finished.
But you know what? The budget's also designed not to be read. This year's budget, 1,400 pages, no tabs, no ability to find references. It's really done in a way so that county government doesn't really want you to know.
Actually, I think the document is pretty straightforward, and I've gone through a lot of those budget books. But I think you need to start educating the public and having the public help set priorities very early in the year. If we started that in January and really made a push to get people out and to participate, that would go a long way to having people understand what the numbers are about and what the priorities are and what's at stake. I mean, the whole current thing with the libraries, for example.
Oh, well, the libraries is just another issue where you see the library reserves were taken, and there's going to be a new library coming in now in Aventura, and the money to be able to furnish and put the books and computers inside the library, well, it was in the reserves, and that was taken last year. Quick last thought, Dan Gelber.
Look, I think this is a very good example of how hard it is to focus elected officials on what you really need to focus them on. But you need to do that because being a voter is as important as being an elected official. It's more important.
And we're out of time. I'd like to thank Dan Gelber and Katie Sorensen for joining us. I'm Helen Foray. Thank you for watching Issues Reports with you in mind.
Issues Reports has been made possible by the generous financial support from Irma and Norman Bremen.
Single penny, not a single line in that budget, the 1.6 billion that says we're going to do this to stop waves from crashing against these facilities.
$1.6 billion, and that's just for starters. It is calculated that the county will be spending upwards of $12 billion over the next 15 to 20 years to fix the county's infrastructure needs. Doug Yoder, Deputy Director of Miami-Dade Water and Sewer, argues that the water and sewer plant in Virginia Key can handle rising sea levels and flooding.
Elevation is really the only defense against sea level and the groundwater rising with the sea. Our facilities here at Virginia Key are at least 10 feet above sea level, and in some cases up to 20 feet. A 3-foot rise in sea level would still leave this plant.
Issues Reports is made possible by the generous financial support from Irma and Norman Bremen.
Hello, I'm Helen Foray. Welcome to Issues Reports, a new program we bring to you that looks deeper into issues affecting South Florida residents. Today, we look at how Miami-Dade County government officials have for years neglected to properly invest in the county's infrastructure, which has now become a multi-billion-dollar headache for all. It is estimated to cost each man, woman, and child $4,700 over the next 2 decades. Are we throwing our money down the drain? Every living of 1972. They are not alone. Federal and state officials have filed suit as well, as seen in a consent decree.
A consent decree is something where the county says, I agree to do this to fix this problem. And the counterpart being the EPA says, I accept your proposed solutions, and by way of this consent decree, we'll make it a legal binding agreement that you will do this in X amount of time. The fact is that several consent decrees have been signed over the years, and the problems have continued. But the bigger problem is that the consent decree does not include any provisions to protect the facilities from the expected impacts. This is not theoretical impacts. These are expected impacts of storm surge, hurricanes, and the exacerbating factor of sea level rise over time. There's no
above water. It would not leave other parts of the service area above water. The Clean Water Act, of course, on which the consent decree is based, never specifically contemplated climate change and sea level rise from back in 1972 and some amendments since then. So there is no set of specific standards that we as a utility, for example, would need to adhere to address that.
But climate change is just one challenge for Miami-Dade Water and Sewer, and aging infrastructure is another. Referring to an underwater sewer pipe, former Director John Renfro is quoted in Miami Today as saying, "The pipe is about to burst. We're facing a catastrophic event if this happens. We can't afford any delay." But they did delay. If there were a break in an underwater pipe, the thing depends upon water to survive. It's a vital resource for our health, environment, recreation, and economy. So it is surprising that Miami-Dade County officials have neglected to repair our county's infrastructure system to the detriment of the environment and the pocketbook.
This has been an ongoing problem of raw sewage, not necessarily a nice topic, but raw sewage flowing into Biscayne Bay, flowing into the Miami River, and out into the Atlantic Ocean. So it's a pollution and it's a public health issue. And there's also a very important taxpayer issue because we're not getting what we pay for.
Environmental lawyer Albert Slapp should know he represents the Biscayne Bay Waterkeepers, an environmental group that has filed a lawsuit against Miami-Dade County for violating the Clean Water Act.